Hello and welcome to Speaking Spirit, where we talk about all things spiritual. Your host, John Moore, is a shamanic practitioner and spiritual teacher. And now, here's John.
Hey everybody, thank you for joining me again. I'm a little later getting this podcast out than I normally would be. Forgive me for that. In the realm of spirit, time doesn't really exist, so I guess it's okay anyway. At least that's what one of my teachers told me. It is just after sunrise here in Maine, and we had a couple of storms come through over the past few days, which dumped a little bit of snow on us, and it's just beautiful. The sun is out, the sky is blue, the sun is streaming across the snow and through the trees, and it's just beautiful to look out. And I hope that wherever you are, you don't have to be in a spot as traditionally beautiful as Maine, but I hope wherever you are, you can find some beauty in something that you can see or touch or hear today. And, looking for beauty, you'll find it. Your intention will guide you. So if you take a little bit of time or just to set the intention to look for beauty today, something that really touches you and makes you feel good and connected today, I think it'll make your day better. I hope so. Today's topic is near and dear to my heart. The topic is, what is shamanism? And I'm going to talk about shamanism. And that is my spiritual home, for lack of a better term. Shamanism is not a religion, so I can't really call it my religion. I could call it my practice, but it's more than that. So I'm going to talk about it. Shamanism is also a big buzzword right now. It's become increasingly popular, certainly in the United States. I see evidence of that happening in other places, and I will talk about why I think that's happening as well. It's not just, in my opinion, some kind of new age buzzword. There is a reason why the shamanic impulse is waking people up across the world at this moment. So let's talk about what is a shaman and what shamanism is and where the word comes from and all of those things. And this will give you some some background at why this why I'm going to talk about it in the ways that I do. I'll say this, that we apply the word shaman and the word shamanism to a lot of different things. And some of that is because it's a challenging, they're challenging words to define. And another reason is they're loan words into English. And their actual origins are a little bit lost at the moment, maybe some linguistic research down the road, but I'll talk about where we get the word from in English anyway. And the words have been applied cross-culturally to all kinds of spiritual workers, spiritual medicine, that sort of thing. Definitions are useful when they're agreed to, but there certainly may not be universal agreement. So when I give you my definition, that certainly is not going to agree with other people, and that's fine. We can disagree about that because words are symbols. They're not the thing that we're describing, right? They're shortcuts into our consciousness. I use this example a lot. If I use the word dog, that's not a dog, but if we have a common understanding of what the word dog means, we can talk about a dog. The map is not the territory. The model is not the thing. The word isn't the thing that it describes. It's just a shortcut. It's a symbol. So the word shaman, and I'll preface this by saying that in my tradition, I do not call myself a shaman. When describing myself, I prefer the phrase shamanic practitioner. Sometimes people will call me shamanic healer. That's also fine if I'm doing healing work. I don't limit myself to healing work, but that's one type of work that I do. And I consider myself a teacher. I teach shamanism and other, spiritual topics. I teach meditation, qigong, and some other, but my main focus is shamanism. So it could be a shamanic teacher, shamanic practitioner, shamanic healer. I don't use the word shaman, and I'll talk about that a little bit later. The word shaman comes into English from Russian and German, okay? And before it was in Russian and German, it was a word from the Tungus people in Siberia. So it's Tungusic, I believe is how you say it, in Siberia. And there it means, what you think, the word shaman means what you think. It's this, this holy person that you go to that does spiritual work for you. They're a spiritual officiant, for lack of a better term. However, roots of the word shaman do show up in some Chinese languages. They show up in Sanskrit. They show up in Pali, the language that the Buddha spoke. And so its exact origins are a little bit lost. In those cultures, in Pali and I believe Sanskrit and in the dialects of Chinese where it exists, it basically means like priest or monk or something along those lines. To the Tungus people, the word shaman means one who sees in the dark or one who sees clearly. And if you ever see video or photos of a Siberian shaman, frequently they're wearing a cover over their eyes, what we would refer to as Siberian eye curtain. Sometimes it's a hat with fringe that covers the eyes. And this is a tool that they use in their work. So what are we talking about when we talk about the word in English? To me, shamanism involves three main components, and if you're not doing them, you're doing something else. And it's fine that you're doing something else, but when I talk about shamanizing, we turn that into a verb. When I talk about shamanizing, I'm talking about three components, spiritual acts that comprise three components. And these will be at the center of what we're talking about. And these are things that, back in the early 20th century, mid 20th century, anthropologists went around the world looking at what we consider shamanic cultures where they would have someone, fulfilling the role of shaman, and looking at what these cultures did in common. What were the common practices, techniques, technologies that they were using? And so there are three of them. One is so the definition is a shaman is a spiritual worker who uses altered states of consciousness to travel in or experience non-ordinary states of reality, and who works with helping spirits to do work, and that's frequently healing or getting information or other things, ceremonies, rituals, that sort of thing. Usually there's a healing component of some kind. So those three components are using altered state of consciousness. It's component one. Component two, traveling in non-ordinary reality. Okay, so most shamanic cultures recognize spiritual worlds that they travel in. And this is the main practice is journeying in these spiritual worlds. Okay, different words for them in other cultures: dream time, otherworld. In core shamanism, we refer to sort of upper world, lower world, middle world. Lots and lots of cross-cultural stuff here. And then the last component is working with helping spirits. So a shaman is always working with other spirits, and they might do that in different ways. It might involve, in some cultures being taken over by the spirit. In some cultures, they're just communing with them or communicating or merging or calling upon them, evoking them, invoking them. But all three of those components are present when we're doing shamanism. So let's talk about altered states. How do shamans enter altered states? And a lot of people, so there's a misconception that all shamans use drugs or hallucinogens, plant medicine, what have you, soma in some cultures, ayahuasca, psilocybin. There's lots and lots of chemicals and plants that can be used to enter altered states of consciousness. And it is true that the use of plant medicines exist in traditional cultures all over the world. So we see, the Sami people in northern Scandinavia. There are rituals involving fly agaric mushrooms. We see in South and Central America, we see things like ayahuasca. We see peyote in the southwestern United States. We see iboga coming from Africa. So these hallucinogens exist all over the place, and they are used shamanically. For the most part, though, the majority of shamanic cultures use other means to alter their consciousness. A big one that I use a lot is to use sound, such as rhythmic drumming, or rattling, or some sort of sound to enter the specific shamanic state. And what we know is that there are different patterns of brain. We know this now in modern times, obviously before the invention of things like EEGs and much more modern science. We didn't specifically have this information, but for thousands of years, shamans knew what they were doing when they were altering their brains. And so they, generate these brain waves using sound called theta waves, right? It's around 4 hertz if you're scientific, or 4 cycles a second, or drumming at 220 beats per minute would give you a theta brainwave state. And in this state, your ego breaks down a little bit. You become much more open and are able to do the things that you need to do to get into a journey much more easily. So drumming is another way. There are cultures, I'm thinking of Bushman cultures in Africa that use, this uses sort of like extreme form of dancing where they might dance for 24 hours without food or water to put themselves in these crazy altered states. Dancing is another really common way to enter altered states. I'm sure there are lots of them. I'm sure there are lots and lots of ways. But there's a specific state that shamans use, whether they're aware of, EEG research or not. But it's common all over the world. And people, I guess, just knew that either through experimentation or through some sort of divine revelation that this particular state, brainwave state, was tuning the brain to the correct frequency for doing shamanic work, for lack of a better term. If we think of the brain not as the generator of consciousness, but as a receiver of consciousness, because I believe that consciousness is non-local, but that the human brain is a receiver that can be tuned. And so tuning the brain to a specific vibratory pattern opens it up to shamanic work. So that's part one. So part one is entering these altered states. Part two is, traveling in non-ordinary realms. And again, like this, there's as I said, shamanism appears all over the world in every culture. It shows up in, it's called different things, and there's always a cultural overlay, right? There's always, the information about it comes filtered through the culture and the cultural understanding of the people that, the group that the shaman, identifies with, that the culture that they've grown up in. So in many cultures, the non-ordinary reality exists and is called, the other world or dream time or lots and lots of different things. Okay. And what we find that's really common is there are usually experiences of traveling down into the earth, which we have called the lower world. And don't worry, it's not, those of us who grew up in a predominantly Christian culture might think that that's hellish or going to hell, because we always think of hell as down and lower and that sort of thing. Those are just, those are symbols that don't really apply here. That's, from another system. Those are symbols from another system. They don't really apply. I travel to the lower world nearly every day, and it is a beautiful nature-like place when you tune into that. And in the lower world, this is where we meet power animals, not to be confused with what have been called spirit animals or totems. Power animals are different. They're animal spirits that we have sort of one-on-one relationships with. And in most cultures, working with power animals is very common, very, very common. These spirit allies that come to us as, sort of in the form of deceased animals. Very powerful work to be done with helping spirits. So in non-ordinary reality, we also consider what we call an upper world. And really these are models. These are labels that we're placing on states of consciousness that are experienced as traveling up or down in non-ordinary reality. There are, as far as I know, infinite levels of reality. There's many, 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 but it just makes it easier. We can't, makes it possible to talk about if we break it down into rather large chunks of description. And so there's an upper world, and a lot of shamanic cultures talk about being, born on the wings of an eagle or flying upward into heaven or being pulled up somehow. And it's a little bit of a different experience there. And there we meet teachers that might be more human-like, less animal-like, although that's not always the case. That's where your sort of human-like helping spirits hang out, where you might meet gods and goddesses and angels and deceased ancestors and that sort of thing, is this sort of upper realm. And then there's this middle world, which is the world that we live in. In Old Norse, we would call that Midgard, right? The middle world. And that's the world that we live in, but there's a spiritual overlay there, right? This is spiritual overlay. And middle world is where we encounter things like nature spirits, faeries and sprites and jinn and genies and all kinds of stuff, right? So that's non-ordinary reality. And then I've touched a little bit on working with helping spirits, right? We have power animals that we work with to do a tremendous amount of work. We have what we call upper world teachers. Most people practicing shamanism will start to gather a community of spirits that they work with. And in my experience, these spirits are a little specialized. In other words, I'll work with a spirit for a specific piece of work. One of the things we do, one of the things that most shamanic practitioners do is a ceremony called soul retrieval, and it's a shamanic way of helping to deal with trauma, amongst other things, but it deals with soul loss, soul separation, soul fragmentation, that sort of thing. And I have a specific helping spirit that I work with for that work. And then another piece of work might be what we call psychopomp work, which is helping helping people who are deceased cross over to where they should be going, sort of, helping with that kind of work. And I have other helping spirits that I work with for that type of work. And so they're a little bit specialized, and they're helping spirits for doing ancestor work, for doing weather work, for doing all kinds of stuff. Okay, so we gather a team, right? A team of specialists, and that's really helpful. And one of the things I like about the practice of shamanism is one of the ways that it keeps my ego from getting really big is that it reminds me that I'm not the one doing the work. We always consider that it's the helping spirits actually doing the work. I'm just acting as a conduit as I possibly can for the work to happen, right? So that's shamanism in a nutshell. Well, that is the definition of shamanism in a nutshell. You have these three components, right, that I've been talking about. So why do we have people acting in the role of shaman in showing up in every culture, in every every location on the planet where there are people? Why is shamanism this universal phenomena, right? Why is it showing up everywhere at all times in recorded history? And it actually looks like shamanism is prehistoric. So I'll talk a little bit about that. But I think you could make a really good argument that would probably be backed up by modern science that shamanic practice, the practice of shamanism, is the oldest form of human spirituality, at least that still exists today. So we might say it's the oldest continuous form of human spirituality. Okay, so we think about, the oldest. I don't know what the oldest sort of modern non-prehistoric religion would be, but we'll say Judaism is pretty old for a Western religion, right? And it's traces back 5,000 or 6,000 years. I'm sure there are Eastern religions that are equally, if not older than that. So religions in Asia, I'm not sure how far back what we would consider the Hindu faith would go back. I know the texts are pretty. Some of the texts are pretty ancient. So yeah, I mean, there are forms of spirituality that exist today that go back several thousand years. The thing is, we have evidence now that we think cave paintings done by humans, but done by what we anatomically modern humans anyway, going back as far as 30,000, 40,000 years, are displaying shamanic states of consciousness. We see these things called entoptic patterns in this artwork. We see therianthropy, so we see paintings of things that are half animal, half person. There's lots of evidence that this is the case, and there is some support for that, some belief for that. So we think that shamanism is probably the oldest practice of spirituality that that still exists today. It goes back tens of thousands of years. We don't really have evidence of humans doing much more symbolic thought before that. It looks like there was a time about 50,000 years ago where humans started, painting pictures, having symbolic thought. But that's just current archaeological evidence. That's just what we have now. Certainly things could become much older, and new discoveries happen all the time that push timelines back for things. So it's possible then to consider that shamanism might be the original form of human spirituality. As soon as humans were able to alter their consciousness, to experience what shamans experienced, they were using that as a tool. And if you think about it, we didn't have modern allopathic medicine developed yet, or even traditional Chinese medicine, or lots of forms of herbology and stuff. And so humans had to survive as a species in conditions that, and with conditions and tools that weren't fantastic, right? Humans are not the fastest runners. We don't have the sharpest teeth, the biggest claws. We're not the strongest. We're not the best climbers. But what humans are, we're adaptable, and we're social, and we have the ability of symbolic thought, right? We have the ability to paint pictures. We have the ability to describe things using language. And that has been a huge survival advantage to us, right? We that symbolic thought, that ability to form even spiritual ideas and gather people together for a common good, those things are what kept humans alive while other ancestors died out. There's not evidence of Neanderthals, for example, doing cave paintings yet. I mean, I don't know. They might discover that at some point. And certainly Neanderthals were probably capable of some symbolic thought. But we don't really have evidence of the level that modern humans had, Homo sapiens. And the same is true for other. So around in the early days of Homo sapiens, there were lots of other races of humans out there. And when I say race, I don't mean the way we think of race today. I mean genus and species, or at least species of humans were different, right? We had Neanderthals, Denisovan man. We had all kinds of hominids out there. And then the one thing that we definitely can see that's different about modern humans is this capability towards symbolic thought, towards religiosity, for lack of a better term, spirituality, right? And, the ability to do spiritual work really, I think, provided an evolutionary advantage that modern humans survived, and other species either interbred with humans but didn't continue to exist as a species. They died out at some point. We do not still have Neanderthals walking around, although some people like myself have a bit of Neanderthal DNA. So there was some interbreeding going on there, but we don't have pure DNA, species of Neanderthals walking around these days. And there's a lot of speculation as to why that is, but I'm just saying that I think one strong advantage that Homo sapiens had was this ability for symbolic thought that at a level, anyway, that we don't see in any other species on the planet. I do believe now they're doing research with primates and birds and showing that they are capable of symbolic thought, and perhaps maybe even super primitive forms of spirituality or ritual, certainly. And so there is that, but certainly not developed to the level where human beings developed it. So one thing about shamanism is that we consider, if you look at the work of Jung, and he talks about the collective unconscious, and we have these archetypes that spring up, which are universal. They're universal patterns that exist in the collective conscious, right? We're not always aware of them. One example is the hero, and we talk about Joseph Campbell's, the hero's journey, which is common in every mythology on the planet, right? So the hero is an archetype. It's a pattern that shows up. And I think the shamanic archetype is the same thing. I think the shaman shows up. I think every mythology on the planet contains elements of shamanic initiation, voyages to underworlds, to above worlds, dealing with spiritual creatures, all of these things. I think the shaman is on one level, a shaman is an actual physical human being doing stuff on this planet, but I think there is an archetype, and I think it pops up everywhere on the planet, and I think it is as old as humanity itself. I think it would be hard. I'm proposing a lot of things that would be difficult to disprove. But this is, I'm posting it as this is my opinion. This is my thought on this after having, read significantly in this area and done a lot of my own research and, in fact, journeyed quite a lot about this. The shamanic archetype activates in human cultures and in human individuals as the result of crisis. And in fact, a lot of the literature talks about shamanic crisis. And what does crisis mean? Crisis is some sort of, we'll say, abnormal threat, right? So right now, as I record this, we are in the middle of a global pandemic. That is a crisis because it is an existential threat to many people. It has changed lives. It has threatened livelihoods. It has profoundly affected our culture, the way, no matter where you are, the way things have been done has changed. And in my opinion, this is one of the reasons why there has been this sort of wave-like resurgence of interest in shamanism. People are waking up to spirituality. They're waking up to this shamanic impulse as a way of dealing with this. It's a response. The awakening impulse, the awakening shamanic impulse, is a response to crisis. On an individual level, most people I know who, there are a certain number of people who are just interested in shamanism and might take a weekend workshop or something like that. But most people I know who go very deeply into shamanism, become practitioners and teachers and that sort of thing, have gone through significant life passages. So this could be, I know someone who had several near-death experiences. For me, it was, it was what we might refer to as nervous breakdown or psychological breakdown that I went through years ago that I didn't know that I could come back from. And it was a mental and physical crisis on an individual level. So we see this showing up again and again, and in many shamanic cultures around the world, shamans are chosen on the basis of having gone through some sort of crisis. Sometimes they have to be born with a physical deformity. Sometimes they might be struck by lightning, have a mystery illness. This is called the shamanic illness. And you'll see it frequently, somebody falling ill with something that medical science has a hard time diagnosing, a hard time treating, that sort of thing. And they'll come out of it, somewhat awakened or with the impulse to do shamanic work. I think I don't know how really to estimate how frequently this happens. Everyone goes through crisis. Does that awaken the shamanic impulse in everyone? I think no. I think there are people who have a kind of a makeup that's geared towards that, and might have been drawn to spirit their whole lives, but never really had a place to do it or a place to put it, but crisis kind of opens you up. It kind of cracks you open, and it's in healing that those wounds, where they're never completely healed, there's always a resonance there. There's a poem that says, the cracks are where the light comes through. Right? It's that cracking apart, that breaking down of the ego sometimes that allows people practicing shamanism to become clear channels, or in some cultures it's called the hollow bone, right? The hollow bone that spirit passes through. So shamanism arises as a response to crisis, personal and cultural. So when culture goes through crisis, a lot of people sort of wake up. And that doesn't mean, when I say wake up, I'm not putting that in the sense of, of like Buddhist awakening, or, ascension, or any of those, like you've reached another level. What I mean is I've been going through my life, and then all of a sudden I realize that, there's this huge crisis I need to deal with, and ordinary methods I might use to deal with crisis are not working for me. And it's a wake-up call. Maybe that's a better phrase, wake-up call, rather than awakening. There's a lot of baggage around terms like awakening and ascension and all of these things. So the shamanic viewpoint, there is a viewpoint, there is a way that shamans commonly look at things. And again, it's different culture by culture. Of course, everybody looks at everything through the lens of the culture that they are, they have been raised in, or that they have adopted, or that they have lived in for a really long time. It's good to be aware of these things, right? So I'm speaking to you in English, and I know that for many of you, English is not your first language. And so when I use words, I know inherently that they may have slightly different meanings for you, and you might be looking at them in a way that you haven't. I have experiences with certain words, with certain symbols that you have experienced differently, and that's fine. So, so when I say that, there's a thing that's common, it shows up in different ways, but this is a fairly common thing. I can't say if it's universal, because then somebody would, if I said this is in every shamanic culture, I'm sure somebody out there could say, oh no, this tribe from here does not believe that way. But when I say common, I would say almost every shamanic culture practitioner has a viewpoint that I would say describe as animistic. Animism is the belief that, one way of describing the animistic belief is that it's the belief that spirit is in everything. This is the way I see it. So I see spirit in trees, in grass, in rivers and rocks, in animals and people. I see spirit, I see the earth as a sort of giant spirit, a giant collective spirit. But spirit also exists in man-made things, so anything you can perceive as a separate object is a spirit. It just has a physical component to it. Okay? So if I make something, let's say I have this coffee cup in front of me. I'm going to have a sip, as a matter of fact. Delicious. This coffee cup in front of me, some human made that, right? Say took some clay from the earth, has some spirit, some bit of the earthly spirit was in that lump of clay, and it was formed into the cup, and then there's this in non-ordinary reality, there is this spirit of the cup. But the cup also has physical representation here on earth, because I can pick it up and I can put coffee in it and I can drink out of it. So we see everything as a spirit. We can talk to most things. Sometimes they talk back. particularly during middle world journeys. You can talk to trees and rocks and get information. And as I said, that a bluebird just flew by my window. I'm not making that up. And it just flew by again. It's sweeping back and forth across my window. So it's lovely to see. I talk to the birds, especially lots of birds where I am. And so the shamanic viewpoint is animistic, that there's spirits everywhere and travel. And I mentioned this before, but in the middle world, there are, you do encounter lots of spirits that do not have a physical component, right? They do not have a physical body. And those spirits sometimes are seen as, and gosh, every culture has some name for little people, right? Little people that are sort of on the edge of spirit and physical reality. I can't think of the term, but there's, in Hawaiian culture, there are these little elves that build things overnight, like they're, giant walls are built overnight by these, these little elf-like creatures. And in countries that were sort of Celtic at one point, so parts of UK and that area, we have a whole faith built up around the faeries, but we have all kinds of European cultures with fairies and trolls and elves and gnomes and all of these things, and we think of them as, we have the phrase in English, fairy tale, right? A story that isn't real, where we talk about fairies and supernatural creatures and that sort of thing. I'll tell you that, reality is kind of a flexible thing. So are there things that are real that aren't reflected in physical reality? Well, sure. Your subjective experience of consciousness, we could go down the rabbit hole of discussing consciousness, but your entire subjective experience of reality does not really have a physical representation. And yes, you could go into a functional MRI machine and say this area of your brain is lighting up and this area of your brain is lighting up, but none of that explains your subjective experience. That's electrical activity. But how do you go through life experiencing the world? How do waves made in the air sound like a symphony to you? How do you recreate a symphony in your consciousness? To me, electrical signals bouncing back and forth can't really explain that. Can't really explain what I'm feeling when I touch something or when I taste something. My experiences of electrical symbols passing back and forth, and to me, consciousness is reality. And so, is it possible then that there are things that are real? I believe my consciousness is real. Maybe I'm imagining my consciousness, but what is conscious of that imagining? Sorry, I'm kind of joking, but it's a little bit of a brain teaser, right? So consciousness is my experience of reality and does not necessarily have a physical representation. So are there things that are real? I can make it simpler. If you have a thought in your head, if you think of a purple elephant, is that purple elephant real? Or not necessarily real, but is the thought real? Did you really have the thought? Did the thought occur in this reality? Were you conscious of it? And the answer to that is yes. So even on just a mental level, there are things that exist that do not have physical representation, that do not have physical bodies. And so whether or not you believe in fairy tale creatures, and you think I'm psychotic when I go out and talk to land spirits or trees or whatever, is beside the point. Like we could potentially agree that there are things that we would describe as real that don't have physical presence. And, there are no cultures I can think of that do not have the belief in non-physical entities, right? So every culture out there believes in spirits of some sort, whether that's the spirit that, whether they're animistic or not, right? We believe that people have spirits, that there are ghosts, that there are, so these things are universal. These things exist in cultures that had no contact with each other for tens of thousands of years at least, right? Maybe longer, right? When humans started, migrating all over the planet, and that timeline keeps getting pushed back further and further. They find evidence of human activity in Europe now going back, tens of thousands of years earlier than they thought humans went out of Africa. So that timeline keeps getting pushed back. So these are universal thoughts. These are things, again, the shamanic impulse, the animistic impulse, all these things are fairly universal. That doesn't mean every human being on the planet believes in these things or believes in them in the same way. Right? There are atheists out there, there are material realists who think anything you cannot measure with equipment doesn't exist. And that's fine. That's their belief. That's their reality. But they can't measure their consciousness, right? They can't attach. You can attach electrodes to your brain, but that is not your subjective experience of consciousness. So I go back to the idea that we can experience things that don't have physical representation. So I just want to recap a little bit, and I hope this has been informative for you. But I talked about shamanism and how it is it is a universal set of spiritual technologies, practices, ways of interacting with spirit that go back at least tens of thousands of years, goes back into prehistoric times. It exists. The shamanic impulse exists. While it is filtered through culture, it exists everywhere on the planet where there are human beings. It arises as a response to crisis, both on an individual, cultural, and global level. And that shamans are, in general, animists, where we believe in spirits inhabiting things, particularly in the natural world, but I extend that to things that are man-made as well. I really hope this has been informative. Shamanism is what I refer to as my spiritual home. Please reach out to me if you have any questions or wish to contact me. You can find me at mainshaman.com. That's maineshaman.com.
You have been listening to Speaking Spirit with your host, John Moore. For more info or to contact John, go to mainshaman.com. That's maineshaman.com.